Okay, so this is the study guide exam 3 review for criminology. All right, so the first question is just asking about the three major waves of feminism. Remember, if you look in your book, they talk about this briefly, but you know, the idea that the first wave was focused a lot on the abolitionist movement and gaining the right to vote for women. The second wave was, took place in the 60s and 70s, and it focused on this idea of equal representation for women in work, politics, and education, right? So really moving women into the public sphere that had been previously dominated by men since the advent of capitalism. And then the third wave centered on issues of multiculturalism and inclusion of all people, so expanding the definitions, including men into the gendered analysis, including trans women, women of color, queer women into the fold, that kind of stuff, which took place from about the 1980s and onward. All right, so the second question is about chivalry, which are just attitudes and behaviors towards women that treat women as if they're on a pedestal, right? But it's also this situation where it might be considered preferential treatment towards women, but it still reflects a power dynamic where men have the ability to give women attention or not, meaning that men still have a more powerful status than women under the understandings of chivalry. Paternalism is similar. Paternalism is just the idea that women have to be protected for their own good, which again implies that women are dependent, men are independent, those kind of gender role expectations. Patriarchy is just the social organization or society where men come to dominate women. So meaning that, we have the roles and expectations of what it is to be a woman is, denigrated compared to that as men. So, women are subordinated within social contexts, legal contexts, and political contexts, where men dominate those fields. Like, for example, the current issue with the healthcare legislation being drafted by GOP Congress members that are all male, right? Those kind of things. That would be patriarchy. All right, and then the different kinds of feminist analysis. Basically, the idea, there's a lot of different kinds of feminism, so I'm just going to test you on these three just to see if you can tell the differences between them, which there are quite a bit of differences, so it should be pretty easy. Liberal feminists are looking more at, the need for women to have the same rights as men. So remember, going back to the second wave of feminism, they would be pretty much considered, liberal feminism is pretty much like the 1960s, 1970s. If your mom is proudly a feminist, then she's a liberal feminist, right? So basically, these women were really looking for rights for women within work, within education, within politics, within sexual freedom, that kind of stuff. But they really thought that the way that you do that is to change the system, like vote for stuff or, just amend the current system. Radical feminists are really looking at the kind of problematic nature of the power differences between men and women, right? So they're saying that there's all of this kind of oppression and inequality that comes from the patriarchal status of society. So really they're saying that, sexism is this oppression that pervades all cultures, that, across the globe itself, right? It's been an oppression for, untold generations. It's, kind of the most widespread, and it's something that needs to be addressed as a social issue. And then postmodernist feminism, so, okay, liberal feminism and radical feminism are coming about at around the same time, right? Liberal feminism being the late 60s, early 70s, radical feminism being the 70s and late 70s. So postmodern feminism is much more recent, right? Maybe 90s or on. Basically, this idea that postmodern is just the definition of postmodernism itself, right, is kind of rejecting the assumptions or ideas of modernism. And really this idea that, technology, those kind of things, that they will solve our problems. that they're rejecting those modernist claims, right? They're saying that there is no fact, there is no truth necessarily. It's all shades of which that are colored by our perceptions and our standpoints, right? So basically they're saying that nothing's really inherently male or female, right? When it comes to sex roles or gender roles or whatever we call them, right? These expectations of what men do, what women do, they're saying there really is nothing that's inherently like the idea of women being more emotional, right? That's not inherently female. It's a reflection of the social criteria by which we judge women and expect them to act, right? So they basically say those traditional assumptions about truth and reality are BS, and that all things come through a lens of subjectivity, so that there really is no objectivity whatsoever. So yeah, those ones are all pretty different, so it should be pretty easy for you to tell which is which. Alrighty, let's see, number 6, the liberation thesis. This is basically this argument that there are two reasons that more women are committing, or that women are committing more crimes, right? One has to do with just the changing self-concept and image of women, that women are becoming more masculinized, which again, this theory has been criticized to hell because it's a little short-sighted. But anyway, and the other one is that the idea that if women are being given more work opportunities, they're opening themselves up to all sorts of crimes they might have been kept away from previously. And then power and control theory really is just trying to say that youth from families that have more patriarchal structures where the father's in charge, he's the head of the household, he might be the only one working, the moms stay at home, that there's a big power difference between the father and the mother that typically, and again, it's obviously assumptive of a heteronormative pairing, right? So basically, they're saying that if there's more gender difference in the parents, that leads to delinquency differences in youth from more egalitarian homes. So basically, like you're gonna see more acting out necessarily from males within a patriarchal grouping, more so than males that come from a more egalitarian grouping, because the idea is that in more patriarchal situations, typically they'll give a lot more freedom to the young men, and they'll constrain the young women quite a bit, right? So this leads to this kind of power dynamic difference where a lot of young men from these families come to believe that that's kind of an accepted expression of masculinity, right? Anywho, so that's a long way of answering that. Okay, let's see. Let's move on to the lockdown. Okay, so, basically, at the beginning of, the lockdown, she talks about the myths and reality. So the myths that we need to address about the war on drugs. And those are just basically that the war on drugs is something that targets specifically kingpins and takes down, drug networks. And that it's only targeting dangerous criminals, right? That's what I'm looking for there. As far as the effect of the war on drugs, that's literally from the slide, the rules of the game, right? Just that there is kind of this undermining of civil liberties that are promised under the Fourth Amendment. Also kind of moving into Terry v. Ohio, just meaning that because of that case itself, police were given authority to conduct searches for people without a warrant for weapons, as if they thought that that person might be suspect or dangerous. And this led to a lot of those kind of justifiable, ideas that lead to stop and frisk and policies of that nature. Those obedience experiments, just the Ash experiment that we talked about, where, basically people saw different line segments and would just kind of like lie to, kind of go to the group mind of what was expected of them, of what other people were asking of them. And really Milgram's obedience experiments, where people reacted in response to, like, they did stuff that they wouldn't have done, like harm another person, because an authority figure told them that that was something that they should do. So really those ones just kind of using that example to illuminate what she's talking about, that a lot of people are susceptible to coercion when it comes to policing, just that they don't feel like they have the ability to say no when someone says, "Can I search your car?" Can I search your bag? Can, you know, when they stop you, oftentimes people may feel coerced into agreeing, right? Even if they don't want to, or even if, you know, obviously there's no warrant, then there's no justifiable reason. All right, so this transformation from community policing to military policing, just to know the difference. I mean, obviously community policing is much more when you police with the community. So like with the support and cooperation of local officials, of local organizations, of religious groups, of things of that nature, so that you're working with the community in order to tackle these issues. Versus what she's arguing is now, and we watched a couple video clips and all those kind of things about military policing, where there's more of this soldier-like military war approach with like tactical weapons and all this kind of crap. Let's see, literally the legal representation one, that's literally what it is. 80% of people are unable to afford a lawyer. That's all you gotta know there. Overloading just means that prosecutors have the discretion to basically pile on a bunch of extra charges that they know they can't actually get through a judge's through a judge in court, but it often gets people to a limit of mandatory minimums where they feel compelled to plea bargain out so that they don't have to face that, you know, long sentence that comes as a result of the mandatory minimum. And then the prison label, just this idea that it creates a second-class citizenship kind of parallel world of stigma and exclusion that she talks about. Really, it doesn't even matter if you went to prison or not. It becomes this idea that you're going to be excluded even if you have that felony label and you haven't gone to prison. And just this idea that it contributes to this, what she calls closed circuit of perpetual marginality. And we just watched a video clip about that, right? How, you know, actually, there's a video clip in the chapter New Jim Crow, chapter 5, where she literally explains what that means. So maybe watch that. Okay, let's see, moving on to Color of Justice. So the colorblind system problem that she's talking about there is just this idea that when people don't critically look at the racial disparities in the laws or how they work with their application, and they don't really understand the idea of like how certain communities are targeted through these kind of policies, then they are looking through this colorblind lens, and that can give them a stigma or a skewing of the reality of the system, meaning that they might appeal to colorblind logic like law and order, like who doesn't want to be safe, right? Or they might argue that, oh, if more people of color are in prison, that must be because more of them are criminal, right? By not actually seeing the real institutional structures of why some people end up overwhelmingly in the system, you know, that can skew the reality of it. All right, so she argues that the system operates in a certain way that leads to the formation of a racial caste, right? So there's a couple stages that she outlines, so which hint is part of your essay stuff, so hopefully you know that too. Basically, this idea where, like, part of what I want you to know about is just those stages, right? The discretion, where police are given the idea of, like, they get to determine who's a criminal, who's not, and obviously racial stereotypes influence that. When the court system itself is disabled so that people can't sue based on that their criminalized status, and just then being kind of locked out and permanently put in a second-class position. All right, media portrayal of the war on drugs. Just this idea that the media itself contributed to this kind of racial caste system because it provided a lot of racialized coverage where it would show police as white, offenders as people of color, and really kind of led to this idea that a lot more crime is taking place in poor communities, not just that there's hyper-policing and more arrests within poor communities. Let's see, racialized public perception for the war on drugs. Really just that it's important to understand why or how people have these racialized public perceptions, because it's not just something that influences, people outside of the system. It influences judges, people on juries, cops, people that make the laws like politicians, prosecutors, any of those people in the criminal justice system, they're also susceptible to the racialized, public perception of the culture. And so really it can influence all of us to see racial minorities as criminals. Alrighty, so let's see. Supreme Court changes. So recent Supreme Court cases from the 90s onward have changed their former position of protecting minorities. So she talks a lot about how before that there were a lot of laws on the books that were protective. So now this really limits opportunities for people to sue against the criminal justice system. It led to a lot of those kind of stop and searchy kind of things. And it's really, upheld sentencing that disproportionately affects minorities. Racial composition of juries. So, when it comes to picking a jury, you can't dismiss a juror because of their race. But at the same time, you can dismiss them for something really stupid like, oh, they're wearing purple, or they're left-handed, or, they have the weird eye or something. Like, you can dismiss them for these other things, but those things could really just be like, you say, oh, well, it's because of that person's left-handed. But really, that's just a roundabout way that people can still manipulate the racial composition of juries. Okay, let's see. Moving on to cruel hand. That's really the answer right there. Criminals are the only group in society we're taught to hate. Most people don't have knowledge of the consequence of their plea deals. Like, they don't really know what's going to happen to them as a result, all the things that they're locked out of. Just this idea of a permanent second-class status, because it's a legal justification. In some places, you can't vote forever. In a lot of places, you're just going to be restricted from all sorts of services. Boxed in employment, just the idea that if people have to check the box to indicate their felony, that means that they're going to likely suffer discrimination from their potential employers. And, less than a quarter of employees are even willing to employ felons. So that makes it really difficult for people of color, especially who already are disproportionately affected by racialized perceptions when it comes to getting jobs. Debtors' prisons, just this idea that, it's supposed to be illegal, but apparently it's still happening. I showed you some videos about it and everything in this country where, basically people are put in jail because they can't afford to pay for things that, minor charges that they got through the criminal justice system. Alrighty, let's see. Minstrel show representations, just the idea that representations of African American men in the media have been used to justify a lot of racism and hatred and, bigotry. And they've really personified black men as dangerous criminals. And, you can even kind of see the way that it's used as a way to kind of like rewrite the history of who people are and what groups of people are and do. And really it kind of makes its way into the modern day culture too, right? She talks about the minstrel issues of the Jim Crow era, but she also parallels that to representations of African American men nowadays as like gangsters or criminals. Alrighty, chapter 12. Okay, so low self-control theory, basically, it's referred to as the general theory of crime. It's this assumption that you have to establish self-control by the age of 10, or you're permanently going to have low self-control, and that's going to lead you to commit more crimes. Sampson and Love's developmental theory, basically the idea that, there's an importance of certain events or life changes that people go through that can alter the likelihood of them committing criminal activities, right? So basically, that's going to affect the development or the likelihood of someone committing crime if their trajectory changes. Meaning, like, let's say you were a criminal, but then you went to college and because of that changed your trajectory, right? Or because of that college, you got a stable full-time job. That could change your trajectory, right? Or you had a child or got married or had some big life change. That could change your trajectory so that you have basically something to lose. So you don't want to mess up, basically. So this idea that it's not about by age 10 and then, oh, you're 11, you're screwed for life. It's more like different life events that you go through can change you. Let's see, Moffat's developmental taxonomy just argues that there's two different kinds of offenders. People that only commit offenses like when they're young, like stupid little minor things, what are called the adolescence limited, right? Like smoking a cigarette or going to a party and drinking or something like that, which is pretty normative of people that are in their, teen years, early young adult, like early 20s. And then there's what they call the life course persistent criminals, who are people that, obviously throughout their whole life commit crimes. Alrighty, Thornbury's interaction model claims that the process of both social control and social learning theory affect each other in a feedback process. So it's not like one or the other, they're actually very connected. And so there's these 5 concepts of the interaction model. So just this idea, like there's the ones that are and again, these are on your slide for chapter 12. And especially in the audio, I go through this a bit because I want you to do well in this part of the exam. But basically, there's some of them that are about attachment, and then some of them that are about, again, this idea that since some of it's coming from social control and some of it's coming from social learning. So the social control stuff is like being committed to school, being close to your family, right? Believing in those kind of conventional values. And then, of course, the association of a person. So those are the ones that connect you. The ones that can take you away from it through social learning would be, believing in delinquent values and associating with delinquent peers. Alrighty, chapter 5. Okay, so basically, just this idea that racism comes from the structure of society. Really, that it's not about people that are just individuals with bigoted ideas, but it's the structure itself that needs to be changed in order to alleviate this kind of what they call structural or institutional racism or institutional inequality. Alrighty. Again, her kind of idea of how it works. This is where she gets more specific about these kind of phases, or what she calls the 3 phases of this, system. So really, you have the roundup, right, where people are kind of taken in. You have formal control and this period of invisible punishment. Okay, let's see. Okay, nothing new. Just that this isn't brand new. This is a system that's been going on for a long time. That you can see it in our history through the legal exclusion of people of color from serving on juries. Right? And also the disproportionate rates of arrest between whites and people of color, and of course the disproportionate rates of incarceration. Let's see. Symbolic production of race. Okay, so really this idea that the racial caste system itself defines how we understand race in a time period. So she says that, during slavery, what it meant to be black was to be a slave. That during Jim Crow segregation, what it meant to be black was being a second-class citizen. And she argues that during mass incarceration, being black is defined as being criminal. Alrighty, and then fire this time, rise of private prisons. Basically, private prisons, just that they're private companies that make billions of dollars to keep, prisons in deplorable conditions. They often cut corners on security and promote more restrictive laws on drugs and immigration to keep prisons at capacity so that they can make more money. And I showed you a couple of videos about that in the audio for that one as well. So really she says that it's important to reject colorblindness in the criminal justice system. Really that, sorry, I skipped this idea. Yes, the system is broken and it needs to be admitted. Let's see. Yeah, rejecting colorblindness because we need to understand that if you're like, oh, I don't see race, that's a problem in the past, but it's not a problem now. It's like, yeah, but if you don't see race, then you don't understand the structure of society that's been built upon racism. Then you don't understand our social and political history that is all wrapped up in these kind of concepts of who deserves value and who doesn't. And it really ignores the still continuing inequality, the segregated unequal schooling that we have, the segregated jobless ghettos that we have, right? And then affirmative action. She just really, talks about this idea that it's just policies that favor members of a disadvantaged group who have historically suffered discrimination in a society. And really, they're supposed to help minorities gain positions in employment and education. So then the black exceptionalism and the trickle-down theory of racial justice is just this idea that, looking at the exceptionalism first is at pointing at people that are successful and then saying that because they succeeded, the inequality that's clearly present doesn't exist, right? So saying like, well, look at Oprah. Look what she's achieved. If racism existed, then how come she's so successful? Or Obama now, people have used him as black exceptionalism, right? Like, oh, well, we've had this black president, right? Which in its own way is bizarre because he's not considered a mixed race president. He's considered a black president, which has everything to do with our racial politics of the one drop rule and all that fun stuff. But anyway, this trickle down theory of racial justice is the idea like, well, if one person of color is in the leadership position, so like Obama, for example, then that means, he's going to do a little bit here and there, and that's going to work its way, down to people that are lower down the ladder that are still facing that inequality, that still aren't able to get past those barriers. So really it's a way to kind of deny the barriers exist at the same time while you're kind of acknowledging that they exist because it has to trickle down to them. Alrighty, short answer essays. Alright, so what are the restrictions placed on felons? So I want you to get into these. Don't just say like, oh, well, sometimes they can't vote. Like, give me the examples. Like, we did this with that 5 acts of the cruel hand. So hint, there's 5 major ones that she talks about, right? So being cut off from food assistance, right? Being cut off from social services, not being able to vote, affecting jobs, those kind of things. Anyway. In addition to these social sanctions, what is the cruel hand, and how does it place felons into a permanent second-class status? So, the cruel hand itself is really just the stigma that comes with the felony label. So not even the felony itself, but it's the revulsion or the looking down upon a person because of their association with that felony status, which kind of gives justification for leaving them in a situation where they often forever do not have access to the same kind of things as a citizen that everyone else does. Let's see, second one, mass incarceration due to Jim Crow because it serves a racial caste system. According to her, how does the system work? Right? Like, hopefully, since there's like already a full question about it, you will have understood how this works, or just at least understand the brief phases. So I want you to explain all 3 phases. I mean, I give you a hint right there, like, there's 3 of them. Explain them. Like, explain what lockdown means. Explain what these things mean. Why has there been so little challenge to the new Jim Crow? That's a whole different thing. I think the first one's easier to explain because she lays it out pretty well. Just explain what each stage is and what its major features are. And then for why has there been so little challenge? Well, really, it's this idea that, especially civil rights leaders have been noticeably silent about issues of mass incarceration because of the stigma attached to criminality and the kind of social deviance, that belief that we have that these people aren't redeemable, that they aren't worth our time. And of course, for minority community leaders that are trying to gain a foothold and status within larger society, it wouldn't necessarily help their goals to associate with groups that are further stigmatized, right? By saying like they support felons or something of that nature. So really that's all I'm looking for there. So hopefully this is helpful.